Hey you guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. If you've never seen me before, my name is Chelsea and I write books about Black girls who aren't all that nice. And we are back for another installment of the Fantasy Author Guidance Counselor. And today, you guys, we are talking about world building. Why? Because I enjoy world building. It is one of my favorite aspects of working on a new project. And two, I just finished Bones to the Wind by Tatiana O.B. and her world building is incredible. So get into it. Also, slight plug, I think my world building and We Are the Origin and We Are Dying Gods is also really incredible, so you can get into those books as well. That being said, quick disclaimer before we get into what we have to talk about today, and that is what I'm about to share with you guys are things that I have learned work for me in my process, and I'm sharing them with you in the hopes that it will help you as well. That being said, though, if the shoe don't fit, don't wear it, okay? If this advice does not apply to you, don't take it, okay? This is meant to be helpful, not hurtful. Cool, great, glad we established that. So let's talk about tip number one when it comes to world building, and that is to hone in on your characters. And you may hear that and be like, okay, Chelsea, you said we're talking about world building, not character development. But what I mean by that is focus on how your characters interact with their world, because that is going to determine what information you need to share within your world building, because the world of your characters should be big to them. And the more you hone in on them and how they interact with their world, that will help you understand where in your world building you need to get into more details versus just leaving it where it's at. Because real life example, the average person does not know how planes fly. They cannot explain to you how a car works beyond the basic explanation. They cannot tell you how to make a cell phone from scratch or how emails or even the internet really actually works. They know that it does work. They know that it's a natural part of their life in their world, but the average person would not be able to tell you every microscopic component of a cell phone or a computer, or how any of the things that they use in their day-to-day life actually work. So keep that in mind when you start building out your fantasy worlds. If there's magic, if there's technology, if there are things where your character would just find them to be absolutely normal, then those are probably not things that you need to hone in on as the author to explain, because unless you have a third person narrator who has way more information than your characters probably do, or your character has a very specialized niche, then it really wouldn't make sense to put that into the book. And that doesn't mean that your world gets smaller. It just means that you have to hone in on what's important to your character. And that brings me to my next point, which is probably my biggest point and the thing that I try to focus on the most in my own writing. And that is to introduce details as they are relevant. Offering context for something in your world by having your character interact with it or notice it or anything like that is how you are going to show your reader that this has importance, right? This is something about how the world just straight up works. For example, if you have read We Are the Origin, then you'll understand that one of the characters' perspectives is Sarah. And part of the reason she is there is because she interacts with the world in a different way than Brandy does. Part of the reason for that is that Brandy has seen more of the world than Sarah has. And so the way that they see things, the way that they interact with it is different. So to get that feeling of introducing details as they are relevant, Sarah notices things that Brandy is just completely normal to her. She's not going to focus on certain aspects of transportation or the way things look, or even the mechanics of crossing over into different parts of the world. That's normal for her because she's done it. So Sarah's perspective is where we, one, hone in on, and two, how we introduce these details as they're relevant. We don't talk about the different aspects of the world until they're traveling to different parts of the world. Until then, it's just this is where we're at. So taking that with point one, part of the thing with world building that I find to be extremely helpful in the long run is to expand the world as your characters interact with it, right? Let's say you have a monarchy and you're starting out in the castle, right? Start out with the castle and then expand to the world outside of the castle, right? And then if you're ultimately going to have your princess or whoever leave, that's when you start explaining and touching on other bits of the world and how things work outside of this very contained unit, right? That's kind of how it works. You start at the base and then you expand out. That's how you make the world bigger without it feeling overwhelming. Because to be completely honest with you, very, very few people want to read multi-pages or multi-paragraphs of description and exposition of how the world works down to the most minor detail, especially if it's not relevant to the character. So it's like if there's a military in your world and they use magic, and there's like the magic corps, but there's also those who use like the knights, who use swords and shields, but the military never comes up, the fighting never comes up, or there's not even another country for them to be fighting with. It's like, okay, but why is that relevant? Why do I need to know this as the reader? Why are you giving me this information without context, right? Which is kind of the heart of all of this information. And it kind of brings me to my next point, which is to fill in the gaps of your world as you're writing. A piece of writing advice that I see floating around a lot, even if it's not explicitly stated, is this idea that you have to have your entire world, your entire book, story, etc. thought out before you ever sit down to write it. Your gods, you need to know your mythology, you need to know your creation, you need to know how the magic works, you need to know the names of all the cities, you need to know the names of all the characters, you need to know the names of everything and how it works before you sit down to write, and that's how you avoid plot holes. If you are a planner and that is your natural workflow, work state, then cool, do what works for you. But if you have tried that and you're like, it doesn't really work for me, or things start shifting when I write, one, you're not crazy. That's how it works for a lot of us. But also, I think it's really important to remember that being an author is actually doing the act of writing. So you have to give yourself space to fill in the gaps as you're writing. And I think it's okay. And I encourage you to be kind to yourself if you don't have all the answers from the first page. A lot of times you don't have the answers from the first page. If there's something that you know is like fundamental to your world, then for sure, take the time to figure that out so that your foundation for your story is solid. But if you know that, hey, I don't have the answer to this right now, mark it and come back to it later. That's what your story Bibles are for. So slight plug, if you haven't seen me talk about story Bibles, check that out so that you don't have plot holes in your book. That helps. But also giving your space to just be like, okay, we'll come back to it. It's okay. It's okay if you have to put something in brackets. Or I have an author friend, and I think this is actually common, but they are the first person to explain it to me, but they put TK in their manuscript because those two letters don't show up naturally. So they just go through and they search their document for all the TKs that they put in. I personally use brackets because that helps me. So whatever it is, just put it in there. For me, for example, I'm working on my next book, Project Necromancer, right now. When I started, all I knew was that, hey, there are like 3 gods and it's based around this. It wasn't until I started writing that I was like, oh, this is how the division of the gods work. And it wasn't until I really got into, okay, how does the magic system work? Because I'll be honest with you, my magic system was weak at the beginning of this book. It was like, okay, I know that she's a necromancer. I have no idea about the other magics in this world. And it wasn't until I started writing it and I was like, okay, she needs someone to do this and she needs someone to do that I started to be like, okay, these are the other magic rules. And even in the most recent chapter, like understanding how accessible magic is to the people of this world and the rules for it. All of those things came as I started writing it. And I was like, okay, the magic system needs rules. And sometimes that does mean you have to go back and add things. But a lot of times I have found that when you introduce things as they're relevant, point number 2, right? And you're honing in on your character and what's relevant to them, then you're not going to have that many gaps in your world building if you're introducing those elements as your character runs across them. And that also makes your world building feel a lot more organic, I'll say, because again, when you're info dumping, when you're giving a bunch of information up front, it can be really overwhelming. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I am definitely one of those people. If I pick up a book and there are a ton of like family trees and stuff in the beginning and they're like, hey, you just need this. I'm like, ooh, I don't know about this. I don't know if I'm going to like this book, because I feel like up front, before I even get into anything, you're telling me that there's so much information in here that you couldn't give it to me within context, that it was going to be confusing. It's one thing to be like, hey, this is for your reference as we go throughout the book. It's a completely other thing to be like, yeah, this information is going to be referenced without ever being touched on or explained in the book. Like, you're expected to just refer back to this to make the connections on your own, but I'm not going to give you any context for it within the story. Stuff like that makes me upset. So I implore you not to be that author. I implore you to give your readers context within the world. So if you have gotten down here, I'm going to give you guys a little piece of bonus advice, essentially. And that is to remember that you can actually change things about your world building. You can follow all these steps and get to the end and be like, okay, I actually need this to be different. You can just change it. Do not feel like you have to force yourself into this pre-made box for your world simply because when you started writing it, you thought it was going to be one thing, and then you got into it and realized it was going to be another thing. If it needs to change, allow it to change. Unless you have a really good reason not to, I think it's really important to remember that you are the author, you are the creator, and there is no rule out there that says that you can't change your mind. There is no rule that says you can't change your story to make it work for you. There's no rule that says that you can't decide that instead of having, I don't know, elemental magic, you want to just narrow it down to like dark and light magic, or you want something that's based off of spells instead of something that's silent, or you want to change that to magic circles, or you want to do something completely different, whatever. It's your story, it's your world, it's your creativity. Let it flow, let it be whatever it needs to be. And as long as you can make it make sense for the reader, you're winning. So that's my 2 cents on world building. If you're like, hey, Chelsea, I'm not watching this video, I'm just jumping to the end. Quick little recap of what I just said, right? So 1, hone in on your characters. Focus on making their world big so that you don't get caught up in making your world so big that it's confusing for the reader. Tip number 2 is to introduce your details as they are relevant. You want to add context because that is how your world makes sense, especially when you have a high fantasy world and you have different cultures, different cities, different names. If there's like a high level of mental cognition that's necessary to get through your book, giving your reader context when you introduce the details is really important. And 3, fill in the gaps of your world as you go. You do not need to have every single aspect of your story mapped out, filled out, written down before you put pen to page for the first time. Fill in the gaps, leave yourself space to be creative, and bonus piece of advice is don't be afraid to completely change your world building or let it morph into something else as you are writing your story. It be like that sometimes. So yeah. That being said, you guys, that is it for my tips on world building. Let me know what is your favorite part of world building down in the comments. If you found these tips helpful, let me know that. If you have other tips for world building, let me know that too. And of course, if you have nothing else to say, you can leave an orange heart in the comments because that's what we're doing this year. So if you guys haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss when I go live. Be sure to check out my Patreon where I will be leaving some extra tidbits and such for the patrons who support. $3 gets you in, $5 gets you into the after chat. All of it supports this channel, me, the Melanin Library, and what I'm doing. And if you want this hoodie, if you want any of the merch, feel free to go to melaninlibrary.com and click on the shop to get yourself some. Treat yourself. All right. That being said, you guys, that is it. Thank you for being here. And until next time, I hope your days are lovely and your books are interesting. Bye.